So we've left generative linguistics behind, but we find there's still an awful lot to say about language. In this video, we're just going to briefly look at the rather oddly Dr. Dolittle type topic of language among animals. Now, of course, language is usually taken to be a purely or remarkably human capacity, and indeed, for many, it has seemed to be one of the two principal dividing lines between humans and animals, which is the other, of course, being reason. Now, you don't have to buy into this, but it's a popular view. But animals make noises, they communicate in various ways. And one question that people have often asked is, well, in what way is human language clearly different from animal communication, and what properties does it have in common? And it turns out that when you try to describe what human language is, you end up with a sort of a shopping list of features of things it does, and we look at some of those. And nearly everything you mention turns out to be found in animal communication as well. So, for example, birds come in two types. There are vocal learners and non-vocal learners. They each have their characteristic bird songs, but the vocal learning birds, they will produce sounds that they have learnt from their environment, usually from their parents and conspecifics, with the result that they end up with dialects. So birds raised in one area will sound quite different to birds raised in another area. The non-vocal learners, by contrast, all end up producing the same stereotypical sounds. In looking into this, it's not quite clear where we should look. One thought is, well, genetically our nearest neighbors are the great apes, the chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, and orangutans. So there was a body of work in the 1970s and 80s, now entirely unfashionable, that tried to teach apes human language. It's been tried in various ways, trying to get them to speak. Doesn't work. Trying to get them to use sign language. We'll have a look at one example of that. Trying to get them to use symbols, computer screens. And apes are just not very interested in learning language, it turns out. The successes have been very, very modest. And the general consensus now is that one shouldn't do this kind of things to apes. You'll see there on the slide, you see Coco the gorilla smoking a cigarette. These apes would now be thought to be the kind of creature that you shouldn't lock up and do this kind of thing with. Perhaps we should look elsewhere. You'll see there a honeybee wagging its tail, and that turns out to have a communicative function as well. There's a video for you to watch this week, 3 minutes or so, which shows the honeybee dance. The way that works is a honeybee leaves the hive, finds a source of pollen, comes back to the hive, and then performs a little dance, wiggling its bum, walking up and down. And the other bees look on, and from that little dance, the other bees know what direction to fly in and how far to fly. So it's communicative. We've fully decoded it. We actually understand this. But it's just, that's all that this can communicate. It's not a general purpose language. So what are some things that seem to mark out human forms of communication as qualitatively different from animal communication? Well, one thing that's noted is that in human language, we use words which are not intrinsically meaningful. If we want to talk about that animal there, if we're speaking English, we say horse. If we're speaking French, we say cheval. If we're speaking German, we say Pferd. And there's many other words in other languages. So clearly, the sound has no direct association with its meaning. Now, very often, things like alarm calls in animals seem to have a direct association to their meaning. They're not arbitrary. If one animal wants to raise the alarm by going gak, 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 it's not going to have the same effect if it decides to use boom, 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 right? So that's generated a lot of discussion. Another thing that seems to single out human language is this notion of displacement. That is, in a conversational interaction like these two old geezers sitting on a bench having a talk, we can talk about things that are not present. We can talk about our summer holidays, distant Caribbean islands. We can talk about the past. We can talk about the future. We can even talk about things that don't exist. We can tell each other fairy stories. When we look at animal communication, whatever's going on always seems to be related to that particular point in time and space. There's no, or very little that we can find in animal communication that looks like this ability to speak about, to engage in noise exchange, which is about something which is not present in the situation. But notice that the honeybee dance, for all its very great limitations, seems to have precisely this property. The honeybee dances, and it's about a source of pollen which is distant. So it's not absolutely clear. But language provides us with lots and lots of tools. As well as making mouth noises at each other, we can also indicate how we feel about the mouth noises we're making. So we not only utter, but we also convey our attitude with respect to what we uttered. This makes it possible in words to say not only there's a mess on the floor, but I am goddamn offended that there's a mess on the floor. We can say something and simultaneously indicate that we don't agree with what we're saying. We can do scratch marks like this, or we can use our hands and body language very often to convey nuances about how we feel about what we're speaking. And furthermore, we can be insincere in this, so we can pretend to mean one thing and actually mean something other. The whole world of deception and lying opens up. And it's not clear that we have any examples of lying in animal communication. One point that Chomsky made was the creativeness of human language. That we have finite resources, we only have a limited number, first of all, of phonemes, and then we only have a limited number of words, but we seem to have an unlimited number of sentences. And to see that this is true, you can just note that if you have a sentence, you can make a bigger sentence out of it by saying something like, I believe that, and then saying your sentence. Or it's not true that, and then saying your sentence. So you can nest sentences within sentences. This is known as recursion. And it produces an infinitely productive resource. In any given language, you have a finite set of words, but they're not all the same. When we were looking at syntax, we saw the difference between nouns and verbs and adjectives and so on. And you've got, as it were, a big store of nouns and verbs and adjectives. And as time progresses, you add to that quite considerably. Words are created and you learn new words. And so your stock of nouns, verbs, and adjectives gets bigger and bigger. New ones come into being, as for example, 100 years ago, it wouldn't have made sense to say that you tweeted something. But in the set of words that you have, there's a smaller set of what are called function words. These help out grammatically. They're necessary for making sentences. They're words like the and. These help us to form well-formed sentences, but the words themselves have no referential meaning in the world. Now, your set of function words will not get much bigger. It is true that they exhibit small changes over time, but much less so than the nouns, verbs, adjectives, which are about things in the world, and when new things show up, we just make new words. I'd like to show you a problem with the work on trying to get apes to speak language. So this, as I said, was done in the 1970s primarily. It's not done now. And people tried all kinds of means to get apes to communicate as if they were using human language. And the apes, as I said, weren't very interested. But very often these apes were reared solely with humans, and so they had no real choice but to engage. And the gorilla we saw, who was smoking in the first slide, that's Coco the gorilla. She's one such ape. And she learned sign language and she could communicate quite a few things using sign language. But we get a flavour for this research when we look at something which was billed as the first live interspecies internet chat. So the gorilla is taking part in something. The gorilla has no idea about the internet, of course, but the gorilla is there with her handler, Dr. Patterson, and people are typing in what they'd like the gorilla to say, trying to communicate with the gorilla. And we have a transcript of that here. So let's have a look. We can see the handles. It's a chat room. It's messy. So someone says, "What are the names of your kittens?" And Coco does the sign for foot. And Dr. Patterson says, "Foot isn't the name of your kitty." Someone says, "Coco, what's the name of your cat?" And Coco does the sign for no. This isn't going very well, is it? But Dr. Patterson jumps in and says, "She just gave some vocalizations there, some soft puffing." And the person asking the question says, "I heard that soft puffing." Now shaking her head no. And then someone asks, "Do you like to chat with other people?" And Coco does the sign for fine nipple. And Dr. Patterson interprets this. Nipple rhymes with people. She doesn't sign people per se. She was trying to do a sounds like, can you see what's going on here? The humans are willfully interpreting what comes out in terms that they want to see. Now, there is evidence that Coco was using signs quite well, but from this particular transcript, we see it's an unholy disaster. It's not communication, and the researchers are not unbiased at all. They are actively trying to interpret whatever the gorilla does as language. So if our view of getting the animals that we think are most like us to speak didn't work out, there were a few surprises in store. 2012 was a good year for Dr. Dolittle. There were 2 papers in Current Biology which alerted us to animals that we wouldn't have expected to speak, seemingly imitating human speech. The first one was a beluga whale. That's the kind of whale you see there on the slide. And this beluga whale had been reared in captivity, had been around humans all its life. And beluga whales make sounds. They make very high-pitched sounds. They have an incredible repertoire of beeps and squeaks and whistles. But this beluga sound was making sounds quite unlike beluga sounds. And when the humans heard it, they recognized that actually it sounded like the beluga was imitating humans. Without being asked to, the beluga was more or less going, "Oh, you humans, you go yakety, 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 yak." Let's have a listen and see what you think. You see what I mean about yakety yak yak? It's going. Now, you might think that's a poor imitation of human speech, but bear in mind this is spontaneous. It's coming from the whale itself. And as a phonetician, I listen to this and I go, wow. First of all, there's isolated phrases. They're at an appropriate pitch range for human speech, not for beluga sounds. Furthermore, they're divided up into syllables, oidi, 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 into syllables. And the pitch within each phrase descends from the beginning of the phrase to the end, something that all human languages do. So there are several clear hallmarks of human speech that this whale has spontaneously got right. The same year, there was a report of another domestic animal, but this time an elephant, who creatively created an entirely new form of vocalization. Elephants don't make sounds normally like this. It took its trunk, stuck it down its own throat, and blew. And in this way was able to make isolated syllables, single syllables, which were understood by those who worked with the animal as Korean syllables that were appropriate for the kind of tasks that the elephant did. The elephant was trained to do various tasks, and by blowing into its own throat, it can make syllables that were appropriate for the task. So 2012 was a funny one. But we like to see or interpret animals as making human sounds all the time. Sometimes it's clear. Parrots, for example, absolutely provide wonderful imitations of human speech. Sometimes we go too far. There was a seal in Boston, a seal called Hoover, who made characteristic noises quite unlike the other seals in the enclosure. And the people from Boston like to understand this seal as if it had a Boston accent. I don't know if you know what a Boston accent is. I'm probably a poor example of it, but park your car in Harvard Yard is an example of a Boston accent. Here's Hoover's vocalization. Now, is that a Boston accent? I don't know. That seems a little bit unlikely. But this goes on, and there's a steady stream of reports of language, well, speech-like sounds from animals, sometimes deliberately, sometimes perhaps coincidentally. In 2018, there was a lot of excitement about a killer whale, an orca, which had been trained to imitate human sounds. So we can hear a little bit of this.
Hello? 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 Hello?
Okay. It's clearly not language. This is not language, but it is speech-like. The whale is clearly matching the pitch variation of human speech. You see how important it is to keep speech and language somewhat separate? So there's a lot more to say about communication among animals and between animals and humans. But the purpose here was to show that when we try to characterize language as a distinctly human property, we're not on entirely safe ground, and it's not entirely clear how to distinguish human language, which comes with so many properties and is so useful and has made such a difference to our species. It's not entirely clear what the borders are between human language and other forms of animal communication.